It's Friday, which means another Q&A. If you guys have questions for next week, please get them in the comments below. Until then, let's get straight into this week's questions. My favorite Dragon Ball Z character and why? Ooh, these are the type of questions that I love to answer. As a kid, my favorite Dragon Ball Z character was Trunks. Because, you know, he comes from the future and he's got a spaceship and he sort of just whisks in and, you know, beats Frieza and his dad, and, you know, he's sort of like this ultimate good guy. You know, he's very much a sort of innocent, pure character in a lot of ways. But I recently watched a bunch of Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z again. I'll often just have it on while I'm editing stuff. And I have to say, as an adult, I think I'm really into Vegeta and his entire character arc, where he kind of starts off as this very selfish, arrogant guy right up to the end where, you know, he like falls in love in his weird way with Earth and all the beautiful things on planet Earth and people, and he, in his way, you know, because he's still very proud, he goes from being this sort of like arrogant guy who only thinks about himself to giving like the ultimate sacrifice to protect the people that he loves. So that's kind of like a beautiful thing about that show, even though like 90% of it is just people like powering up for a fight. Something like a matrix power amp compared to a tube power amp for your fractals and Kempers and Line 6 stuff. I do have a quick little video that I did a few months ago where I compared my matrix with the Axe-Fx power amp modeling on to my Mesa 250 without the power amp modeling. And for me, when you're using high gain sounds, a lot of the time you're relying on preamp distortion. You're doing most of your tone shaping in the preamp. And in that case, I mean, if you're running something like a rectifier where I always keep the master volume very low, there's not a massive difference. There is a little bit of a difference. I really like having the solid state power amp so that you can have all the power amp modeling in the box and have control over it, but I really heard the difference with stuff like your non-master volume models, like say like a Plexi or something like that, something that really relies on power amp distortion and overdrive. At the end of the day, you can make both of them sound unbelievably good with any of the modelers on the market, I think, at the moment. It just comes down to your personal preference. You know, if you really like using a cab and you love that thud and you want to be locked to one particular power amp that you like, by all means go and get a Valve power amp. For me, when I use a cab though, the Matrix stuff stacks up great. It's really clean, it's really punchy, and I haven't had any issues with it even when we're running guitar out of one side and bass out of the other side. How do you deal with multiple guitar parts in a recording and working on the transitions between them? I'm assuming you're doing something like you might have a clean intro that goes to like a heavily distorted section and then maybe another section which sounds a bit lo-fi and might have some weird modulation effects and things like that. They're the three things that happen to me on recordings a lot of the time anyway. I found the best approach with that is to always record a little bit more. So your clean intro, so you've got delay and reverb on it, you want to record the last chord or note and let the trails ring as long as possible, and then you're going to have your distorted thing kick in and say that goes to another section. Let the last chord ring out or something like that. This is on a recording, of course, and then that way, when you're mixing, you can deal with all of those things in the mix, and you can deal with your relative levels, you can deal with your crossfades, you can kind of do all of that stuff in post and just worry about getting the performance and getting the sound right when you're actually recording it. If you were doing it live, of course, you'd want to build a patch which has smooth transitions between all of those sections with all the various, you know, clean to distorted sounds kind of leveled out as well. So that's something that I remember when I started out recording as well. It's like, oh, I want a clean section here. How do I do it? Do I just do it on the fly? And you know, that means it's part of the performance, which might work if you're going for that live kind of thing. But a lot of the time, with most modern recordings you hear anyway, it's all just going to be multi-tracked and you deal with it in the mix. Which IR manufacturer should you go with for third-party IRs for your AX8, or I guess really any device? Personally speaking, for me, 95% of the time now I use my own IRs, and I'm also a big fan of the York Audio Impulses. They're the ones, for me, for the sort of sounds that I like, that I found when I got them. I bought the bipolar pack and it was like, oh, this just immediately sounds good with a bunch of the amps that I like. Ownhammer do really great stuff as well. I got their Heavy Hitters cab pack a long time ago, and I still use it from time to time. I really like their Ubercab pack as well, and yeah, their stuff gives you so many options. You've also got the ML SoundLab stuff, which sounds really, really good. They've got a lot of stock cabs in the Axe FX and the AX8 as well, which are always pretty much grab and go. It really just depends on what you like. Most manufacturers as well will have free IRs that they give away, and I would recommend checking those out. You can go and check out my free IRs if you're a Fractal user and load them in. Another company I'd recommend checking out if you want some oddities as well is Dr. Bonkers. I really like his stuff. He's got some very, very interesting cabs. I mean, most people focus on, like, you know, Messer with V30s, Marshall with greenbacks kind of thing, which is cool, you know. They're the main flavors people want, but it's like, if you want a Friedman 1x12 or, you know, you want an obscure Marshall cab, the Dr. Bonkers stuff is really good as well. But yeah, you can try my free IRs, of course, or I highly recommend the York Audio stuff. I use it pretty frequently as well. Revisiting old amps from like the late 70s and 80s, especially solid state amps, it seems to be a thing. I mean, a lot of people forget that a lot of classic recordings actually used solid state amps, and especially the idea of having clean headroom was a pretty new thing. You know, if you wanted your amp loud in like 1968, you only really had a few choices, and a lot of them started to distort naturally because they didn't have a lot of clean headroom. And you know, you have something like a JC120 come out where it's like, hey, you can just turn this thing up and it's clean. This is a good thing, right? So it's sort of a similar thing I think happened with PAs as well, where you had improved PA technology which could give you clean headroom all the way up to stadium sizes. You weren't relying on like a backline of 20 different Marshall cabinets or something. So it's almost like the challenge went from, you know, how do I just get a loud distorted sound in, I guess, the mid to late 60s, you know, the birth of that like Marshall sound that guys like Clapton and Townsend were all after. And it went to, how do I get a really good distorted sound at low volumes, and how do I get a really good clean sound at high volumes, as opposed to the other way around. So yeah, there's a lot of amps people are rediscovering, which is kind of cool, which just kind of goes to show that it's like, I think I say a long time ago, let's say the late 70s, it was like, my Marshall sounds good for distorted sounds. My JC120 doesn't sound good for distorted sounds. My Marshall is tube, my JC120 is solid state, tube good, solid state bad. And people still have that attitude with a lot of stuff, and there's a lot of classic guitar sounds made with solid state amps, or you know, more affordable amps would be another good way of putting it. So I think it's just one of those things where a lot of the time stuff is either before its time, or for, you know, reasons to do with the market, or maybe the company didn't have an advertising budget, so they flew under the radar. There's just been so much good stuff, and it's always fun to see what gets rediscovered. But then again, you know, like a Marshall Plexi with everything on 10 is still kind of the greatest thing ever. It's just really loud. Are there any WGS IRs out there? I think there's a few companies doing them, but I've got a couple of WGS speakers sitting in my 4x12 cab, so over the next couple of weeks I'll try and shoot some IRs which sound good, and you know, put some individual and some mix IRs up there for you guys, because I think the WGS stuff definitely has its own voice, especially in comparison to the Celestion IRs. I know there are a lot of like Eminence and EV and Jensen IRs out there as well, but yeah, WGS they make great speakers, and I think there should probably be more IRs out there of their speakers. And to finish off today, a little bit of self-interest, my favorite Ragdoll song. I'll break this one down into two parts. My favorite Ragdoll song to listen to, and my favorite Ragdoll song to play. We have just finished getting a new single together, so it should be out in a couple of weeks. So I'm really enjoying listening to that one, because it's one that I haven't listened to like 10,000 times before. But I still think it comes down to Shine is my favorite Ragdoll song when I'm just listening to our stuff. You know, I still keep one of our CDs in the car and listen to it from time to time, because it's like the only CD where I know all the words, and I use it to practice my singing as well, and just try to keep pace with Ryan. But yeah, Shine for me is like, that's the Ragdoll song in a lot of ways, so that's my favorite one to listen to. When it comes to playing them live, I love playing All I Want live, just because it's such a, like, you know, 2.5-3 minute slam to the face, and I really like playing God live as well, because it's just like 4 minutes of chugga and ballsy riffage, and I love feeling the drums and feeling the bass in that song on stage when we're playing live. As always, thank you guys so much for tuning in. I'll remind you, if you've got questions for next week, please put them in the comments below. Have a great weekend, have a great week, and I'll see you next time. See ya.